Oh, I felt my buzzer ring. It's time. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Western Heritage Center for another high noon programming. We've been really fortunate to have some great programming that coincides with the American Indian Boarding School exhibit, which is actually closing next week. So we had our 6-week run. May 25th is the final day. The exhibit will be open, then it heads to California and then I think South Carolina. So maybe it's an excuse to go to South Carolina, right? So anyway, we're very excited. The staff is excited. Lauren's been doing some tremendous research on this topic, and so I'll move right into a little bio. She has no idea what I wrote. A lot of times I put a sentence that's made up, so you'll see her flinch. So Lauren Hunley is a museum educator with 20 years of museum experience. She's good, okay. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from the University of New Mexico and a Master of Arts in Learning and Visitor Services in Museums and Galleries through Leicester University in England, because that's not how it looks if you read it. She is the author of 101 museum programs on a shoestring budget and has presented, which I believe the Western Heritage Center is in your book. Good. And has presented at numerous museum conferences. Currently the community historian at the Western Heritage Center, Lauren serves on the board of directors for the Mountain Plains Museum Association and is a certified interpretive trainer and guide with the National Association for Interpretation. So if you ever have a group of people that needs a rigorous interpretation guide process, she can come and work with your business or your group for 2 full days, right? Isn't that what it usually is? However you like. So anyway, without further ado, politics, photographs, and football, the dual lives of Frank Shively and Alexander Upshaw, Lauren Hunley. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I have to put on my leash with my speaker here. Okay. Well, folks, thank you so much. It's incredibly powerful and important for me that I am the last speaker that is here to speak in connection with this exhibit. You know, I'm following 2 incredible researchers and speakers that I cannot hold a candle to in Euphna Soldier-Wolf and Dr. Janine Pease. But what I'm hoping that we can do today is to take a look at 2 men whose stories are largely unknown. Their stories have been undertold, they have been ignored, they have been forgotten, and yet when we take a look at what we're going to be getting into today, you cannot talk about some of these really incredible pieces of Montana history without these men. I need to acknowledge the fact that some of the subjects we're going to dig into today, we're going to basically take the rock skipping approach. We're going to cast out our line, we're going to skim the surface, and we're not going to go too deep simply because of the limit of our time. We are going to look instead about how these really incredible, huge components of American history and of Montana history, they're so complex, they're so important, and they're so deep. We are only going to look at them as they directly relate to Frank and Alex today. My research has been incredibly involved, from newspapers to other lecturers, other researchers, and to family. And so I want to take a minute to acknowledge the fact that I have been able to pull and learn from others, including Harlan Conroy and Leroy Barnes. Leroy is actually Frank Shively's grandson, and Harlan is his great-grandson. So having family input has been incredibly important for us, as well as the research of Dr. Janine Pease, Tim Bernardis, Rodney Thomas, and the Washington State University Archives were also really, really invaluable in giving us access to some of their records. So I would like to open by introducing you to these 2 men, Frank Samuel Shively and Alexander Upshaw. These men straddled 2 worlds. In fact, I would argue that they lived 2 lives simultaneously. They become cultural brokers and living a reality of cultural duality. in that they are both Native, they're Crow, but they're also educated and assimilated in the way that the American government planned through the boarding school system. And because of that, they're never really accepted by either side. And yet we find them having to navigate the reality of Native identity at the turn of the century. What does it mean to be Crow? What does it mean to be Native? What does it mean to be American in the midst of all of these challenges? It's important too to acknowledge the fact that both of them have deep, deep roots on the reservation. Both were born in the early reservation, as in before it was shrunk 4 times. It's a little bit difficult for us to pin down Frank's birth date. He was born somewhere between 1873 and 1875. There's a couple different sources that put him all the way up to 1878. That's a little bit impossible though, because his father, Samuel Shively, who was a Union veteran of the American Civil War, actually died in a Siouan, a Lakota ambush and conflict in 1875. And so we know that Frank had to be born 1875 or earlier. His mother, Girl Sees the Weed, died in childbirth. And so from a very, very early age, Frank is an orphan. And he's raised at least through his early boyhood by his grandparents, 2-barreled gun, and kills the leader. It's also difficult for us to pin down Alex's parentage as well. And that's because depending on your source, his parents have multiple names. We're not real sure, is it this person, or are both of these names for the same person? Because names can change in the Crow tradition, in the Upshaw tradition. So for Alex, we have his father as either Crazy Ponderay or Plenty Bear, could be the same person. We also have his mother as Big Head or Good Hair, could also be the same person. But what we know is that both of these young men, born early boyhood on the reservation, and they are both named in the Crow tradition. Frank's name translates as braided scalp lock. Alex's name translates to his horse is chief. Later on, Frank would have a second name that translates to owl that turns over. But you will often see him referred to as braided scalp lock in the literature. It appears that both men received at least an early education on the reservation through some Western source. It's not real clear whether they attended a direct school or if they just had exposure through missionaries or a single visiting teacher, but by 1888, they are looking for opportunities to expand their education. And so in 1888, Alex is sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and he's joined in 1890 by Frank. And so here in this 1891 photograph, we can see them, well, we know this is Frank Shively. We know this is Frank. He is unidentified, but I'm pretty sure that this is Alex. Very young teenagers. Look how young they are. And as students, by the way, all of these students are Crow, so all of these students would have come from the Crow Reservation. As students at Carlisle, they are now part of the fast-moving machine, steady juggernaut of the government's assimilation plan. They are being educated, indoctrinated, into the government's idea of what it means to be Native here at the turn of the 20th century. The true belief was in order for Native people and Indigenous people to survive, not just culturally, but physically, if they were going to survive, they needed to become American and part of American society in whatever manner possible. And in order to do that, part of the education and training was to instill a sense of shame for all things Indian. So they do this physically, cutting your hair, forcing you to change your clothes, denying you your language. But they also do this culturally, and they do this socially as well. I think Martha Waldron in an 1896 report really said it best. She said, "The work of the school then is to build up from the beginning the whole child, to expiate the sins of the past by the heroic work of the present." And so both of these young men are stepping into the Carlisle education system with this idea. And they know that they're going to receive a class list that probably looks very, very similar to what you yourself received. I mean, who here took US history and grammar and language and geometry and physics and biology, music, art classes, on and on and on and on. Although I don't know how many of us took a class called hygiene. I would like to point out, just so that you can put a pin in it, they also receive specific classes in rhetoric, debate, civil government, and language. Hang on to those. We're going to come back to those classes in a little bit. In their studies, Frank would be rated a good student with good conduct. Alex would be rated a student with excellent conduct, but medium scholarship. Both would be molded into the model Carlisle student. They would both graduate as Carlisle men. But perhaps one of the most important components of their Carlisle education had nothing to do with what was happening in the classroom. It had to do with the social component. And both Frank and Alex step up and they find an amazing outlet and opportunity through sports, specifically through football. Now, Carlisle had had a football team as early as 1894. Now, we need to take a minute to look at what football meant in 1894. They didn't have to wear pads. If you were lucky, you had a really thick sweater. No helmets, no cups, no pads, no nothing. There was no passing. It was basically rugby. You had a great big ball, you'd hand it off, and through a series of handoffs, you would try to get down to the other end zone without losing your teeth. Quite literally, without losing your teeth. The Carlisle team, when they were established actually through the entire reality of Carlisle having a football team, they never had a home football field, which means all of their games were away. All of their games were played somewhere else. And Carlisle is run basically as a high school. So you have high school boys who have never been introduced to football until they got to high school, and the only teams available to them to play were the Big Five colleges: Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton. So they're little. They're largely undernourished, but they're fast. Frank would join as a halfback and actually play quarterback for a little bit before a preseason injury set him aside. Alex stepped up as the left tackle. It is most likely that they played on the 1896 football team. It is very, very difficult for us to find us in those early records because Carlisle, the literature, is only interested in the starters. So if you didn't start, good luck. Thanks for your time. In fact, if you go back and you look at the Carlisle records today and you pull up football photographs, the photographs only have like 6 men in them because those are your stars, those are your starters. The photograph that you see here is of the entire 1896 team, and only 6 players are identified. I think, don't quote me, I think this is Alex, and this might be Frank. This would have been their junior, senior year. And as players on the football team, football was incredibly popular for Carlisle students because most of them are coming from a Plains Indian tribal tradition where warfare is absolutely integral to the cultural component and cultural masculine identity. Football uses the same language. Football has 2 sides that battle against each other. It uses tactics. It uses strategy. You go out and you're literally getting in a fist fight on the field for many of these guys. And so we can see the attraction for these students to want to play football. It's a way for them to hold on to a tribal identity, those tribal components, cultural components, in a way that is acceptable to American society. In fact, in 1900, the Harvard football coach would call football the, quote, ultimate expression of Anglo-Saxon superiority. And so here we have this team of upstart, small, native kids, and they're not only playing, they're winning. And they're winning by a lot. In the 1896 season, the Carlisle team scored over 200 points. They had less than 100 scored against them. Because of a lot of things, but one of the issues that we see come up is that the teams that they are playing against do not like the fact that the Carlisle team is playing. They do not like the fact that they're there, that they have to put up with them, that they have to play against them. And because of that, the Carlisle players are facing incredible racist heckling from the bleachers. They're suffering cheap shots from the opponents and outright prejudice from the officiating crew. It was very common for a single foul never to be called in favor of the Carlisle team. It was very common for really, really nasty things happening at the bottom of the scrum. It was really common to hear things about scalping and war paint, allusions to Custer's last stand, war dances, war chants, and the lack of tomahawks coming from the bleachers. And yet these young men step forward in a really amazing way. And they start making a name for themselves. They're drawing attention to themselves as in a positive capacity. Harper's Weekly in 1896 would say, "Too much praise cannot be given this Indian team for its showing this year, and above all for its sportsmanly conduct and clean play." And the way they comport themselves on the football field is starting to make people question their preconceived ideas about who Native people are off of the football field. The Boston Transcript would write in September of 1896, "The Indian football team at Carlisle School is one of the best in the country, which means either that the Indian readily adapts himself to civilization, or else football is not a civilized game." Edward Marsden of Lane Cemetery would be quoted as saying, "If the Indians can win in a football contest, I do not see any reason we should not give them a chance in the higher contests of life, as are found in science, politics, law, religion, and education." If they're able to pick up the game and comport themselves like this in a football field, what would they be like in a boardroom? Maybe we should give them a chance. The attention that they're drawing to themselves continues, and in 1896, 1897, and 1898, they would face Cornell University. They would win one and lose two games, but more importantly, they attract the attention of Cornell's coach, a young man named Glenn Pop Warner. Pop Warner would say that the team, when he saw the Carlisle team on his schedule, he knew it would be the roughest game of the season. And he went on to say that the Indian boys appealed to my imagination. And in 1899, Warner would actually accept the head coaching position at Carlisle. And because he's now coaching the smaller, faster, malnutrition team, he has to be incredibly innovative in coming up with ways to get around these bigger, faster, stronger, meaner teams. And so Warner starts innovating. He starts coming up with these weird things to make it work. And he would often do something with his players, and the next season they would make a rule that said that that was illegal, and so he'd have to go back and make something else up. But when you look at the list here of Warner's innovations, I am a huge football fan myself. NFL season's schedule just came out, FYI. I cannot imagine American football today without this. The forward pass, tackling dummies, body blocking, the three-point stance, trick plays. All of these start with Pop Warner and the Carlisle team. And Pop Warner is drawn to the Carlisle team because of the 1896 football team with Alex Upshaw and Frank Shively. Now, unfortunately, Frank and Alex were not members of that 1899 team when Pop Warner took over because they graduated in 1897. And they graduated as full-on Carlisle men. They bought in to the plan. They bought into the education that they had been given, that in order for the native man to move forward and progress and be successful, he had to put off all of the old cultural indigenous ways. In fact, Alex would be one of the students to give a speech at graduation. His speech was called "What the Indian Owes the United States Government." His concluding paragraph, I'd like to read it. It says, "In the closing years of the 19th century, the destiny of the red race is resting upon our shoulders. Upon us lies a solemn responsibility. We have the world before us to fight. And unless we break away from our tribal relations and go out into the world as men and women, we will remain Indians and we will perish as Indians." After graduation, Frank and Alex are going to diverge a little bit in their path. Alex is going to attend the normal school in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania to receive his teaching certificate, at which he is likely the only native person. He's likely the only person of color in his class. Frank would attend Carlisle Business College, where he would receive additional instruction in bookkeeping, commercial law, penmanship, rapid calculation, shorthand, typewriting, on and on and on. Frank would then accept a position in Lapwai, Idaho at the Nez Perce Indian Agent's office. He would actually be on the reservation at the same time as Chief Joseph. And interestingly enough, we aren't as interested in what he's doing in Idaho as we are in the fact that 3 days a week, he's catching the train to Pullman, Washington, where he becomes the 4th coach for the Agricultural College Experiment Station and School of Science of the state of Washington. Now, thank goodness in 1905, they decided to change the college's name to Washington State University. In this capacity, Frank is coaching the team from 1898 to 1899 with an undefeated home record. Don't get too impressed. They had a 1-1-1 record. He is the 4th coach in the school's history. He is the first of 4 coaches that would all come from Carlisle. And in my research, 1898, this makes Frank what I really believe is the first collegiate coach of Native ancestry. When you Google and search who was the first collegiate coach, Frank's teammate, Frank Pleasant, Carlisle teammate, comes up. But he wasn't a coach until 1910. Frank is here a decade earlier. The minor distinction that I think may come into play here is the fact that Frank was unpaid. It was said Mr. Shively was not regularly employed, for at the time, the employment of an athletic coach from public funds would have been a great scandal. But he was loved and respected enough by his players that they would actually take up a collection among the players in order to help him cover his expenses. So while Frank is busy splitting his time between Lapwai and Pullman, the work that actually puts food on the table versus the love of your life, football, Alex actually makes his way to Genoa Indian School in Nebraska as a teacher. And while he's there, he is approached to serve as an interpreter for the Crow attendees to the 1898 Omaha Exhibition Indian Congress. They likely go to Alex because they say, "You're already there, so we don't have to pay for somebody to go with them." While he's there as an interpreter, he is photographed by F.A. Reinhardt in his Omaha studio, and we can see the photograph here. But interestingly enough, for both men, they are very, very intentional, even though they're both working with Native people, they're very intentional to separate themselves culturally from them. Frank, at the same time he took this sitting, would actually have another photograph taken that we see here. This is not Frank's clothing. This is a leather beaded outfit that would have belonged to the studio, and he made Frank wear it. And if you ask me, Frank does not look very, or not Frank, I'm sorry, Alex. Alex does not look very comfortable in it. He looks very stiff. You can tell he doesn't want to be seen wearing Native clothing. In fact, a rumor would actually make it all the way back to Carlisle that Alex participated in a sham battle at the Indian Congress. And this rumor so upset Alex that he writes back and he says that he would have it distinctly understood that that statement is false and injurious. I went with the Crow Indians as their interpreter. And he expressly rejects dressing up as, quote, a common Indian. Frank, at the same time, would be listed as attending a Nez Perce war dance in Lewiston, Idaho, but it's very specific that he is witnessing, he's observing only, he is not participating. And so we can see both of these men really internalizing that Carlisle message. I may be Native, but I don't want to be associated with any of that Indian lifestyle. By 1902, both men have returned to the Crow Reservation, where they receive a very mixed reception. Just like every other boarding school student who returns to their reservation home, they're met with a mixed acceptance. Some people are incredibly proud of their achievements in their education, while others believe that if you wanted to become white, you should have stayed in the white world. On the Crow Reservation, Frank is very quickly hired and becomes a clerk in the Indian agent Major Samuel Reynolds' office in Crow Agency, and Upshaw becomes a farmer in the St. Xavier area. Both of them immediately step into roles as interpreters, having both knowledge of the Crow language, knowledge of Indian Sign Language, and knowledge of English, because that's what they had been speaking for the last how many years. But the reality is that when they step on the reservation, they come face to face with what assimilation actually means. It's really easy to learn about something in a book, and yet when you're faced with the malnutrition and the manipulation and the victimization that is happening on the reservation, it's really, really hard to hold to that book knowledge. It's really, really hard to continue being a company Carlisle man who believes that anything Indian is shameful when you're seeing the eradication and the systemic victimization of what's happening on the reservation. They're not the only ones who see this, by the way. And at the turn of the century, there is an incredible movement in academic circles in the belief that Native cultures are dying, not being erased, they were dying, and that we need to protect and document them before they vanish forever. This was called ethnographic salvage, and a lot of non-Native academics and artists were moving onto reservations for short windows to specifically document and record these cultural components before they, quote, vanished forever. Now, this of course is a perceived cultural inequality and an unacknowledgement of the fact that culture changes by nature and by definition, and that people maintain control over how they want their culture to change. All they saw was that the old way is going away, and we need to take pictures of it and record it before it's gone forever. This opens the door for both Frank and Alex. And in 1905, when Edward Sheriff Curtis comes on the reservation to collect the material for Volume 4 of the North American Indian, a massive ethnographic documentation production that he was doing with all Native peoples across the US, Upshaw, Alexander Upshaw, becomes his lead interpreter. Part of Curtis's work, he was especially interested in recreating, restaging, and redressing pre-reservation ceremonies, activities, events. In this capacity, as his lead interpreter, Upshaw arranges for Harry Moccasin goes ahead and White Man runs him to walk him through the Battle of the Little Bighorn site. He also becomes incredibly important in connecting and making relationships with other Native people for Curtis to stage the photographs that he wants. And if you look at this photograph here, this is Alexander Upshaw. He's bare-chested and he's wearing a headdress. This is something that he expressly separated himself from 7 years earlier. And so we're already seeing a growth and a change in his understanding about what it means to be Native. Instead of putting off everything connected with Native people, he's coming to what I call an uneasy pride in what it means to be Crow. Upshaw would continue to work with Curtis, making himself almost invaluable to Curtis's efforts. He would use his own tribal connections for more intimate and agreeable portraits with Curtis's subjects. He reviewed exhibition notes. He wanted to work to verify the consistency and accuracy of the translations. He offered ideas on the narrative. He suggested picture themes. He came up with strategies to gain cooperation. And it was Curtis even makes a note that Upshaw actually had to leave the reservation for a week in order to interpret at a court case in Helena. And Curtis admits that all work stopped when Upshaw wasn't there. And while Upshaw is working with Curtis, Frank is doing the same thing, but with a photographer a little bit closer to home. Another clerk in Reynolds' office in Crow Agency was a young Métis man named Richard Throssell. We actually have an exhibit on him downstairs. I encourage everybody to go take a look. Throssell gained education and developed his own interest in photography. And Shively worked with Throssell in that relationship to help him network throughout the reservation itself. In fact, Frank may have been one of the original sponsors for Throssell's adoption to the Crow tribe. We know for certain that Frank witnessed that adoption ceremony as the certified interpreter for the event. Throssell would then go on to take thousands of photographs on the reservation, documenting Apsáalooke Crow life, photographing Lakota and Tsitsitsa, Sioux and Cheyenne life as well. And then over a decade later, when Throssell would move from photography to take a stab at publishing, he would come back and tap Frank again as a potential contributor to his work. And what we see is that both men are being forced to grow and re-acknowledge who they are, their own identity, and what their relationship is with their own tribal people on the reservation. And both of them are stepping forward and taking on a more active advocate role, at least on the front end, starting with outsiders, depending on outsiders to document and control this narrative. Upshaw, of course, through Edward Curtis, Shively through Richard Throssell. Unfortunately, neither man really gets the credit from these outsiders that I truly believe they deserve. Curtis, in his private documents, would praise Upshaw for his invaluable help, and yet publicly, within the Volume 4 of the North American Indian publication itself, he never mentions Upshaw by name, and he only references his, quote, interpreter possessing far more than ordinary ability in the introduction. Shively would never receive direct acknowledgement from Throssell for a variety of reasons. And even when he worked with other ethnographic salvagers like Frank Linderman, Shively would actually be Chief Plenty-Coups' lead interpreter when Linderman would interview him in 1926. Linderman specifically describes him only by his Crow name, Braided Scalp Lock, and it gives the illusion that Plenty-Coup is sitting beside another man in a loincloth. It never really does justice. It does not envision the dapper man in a suit that's living a Western lifestyle, a man who's lived his life as Frank Shively. And so even Linderman is intentionally misinterpreting this man. Both Upshaw and Shively would take steps to go beyond depending on outsiders and see that, you know what, if somebody's gonna speak for the Crow people, maybe it should be a Crow. Maybe it should be somebody who actually understands the language, understands the history, and knows what's going on. And so both men actually step forward to document and report their own tribal history at this point. This is a huge step for them because just less than a decade earlier, here, 1908, Upshaw is giving speeches about what the Indian owes the US government. And now here, he's being commissioned to travel with his wife to reservations across the country to specifically record and write those tribal cultural stories. In fact, the article would say where a white man would find it impossible to break down the barrier of reserve thrown up by the Aborigine when his pale-faced brothers ask impertinent questions, Upshaw, to whom the Indian is an open book, goes into the teepee and gets to the heart of the mythology, folklore, and tribal customs that contribute to make the great history a work unparalleled. Shively would become a regular contributor to numerous newspapers and magazines throughout the region, including the American Indian Journal. The Great Falls Tribune would say, Shively said the Indians are trying to tell their own story to white people. Not bad for two men who were taught that all vestiges of native culture had to be erased for survival. For both of these men, their movement and growth into becoming an advocate is really going to become evident and vital when we look at the historical context of what's actually happening on the reservation at this point. Because it's right around this same time period that the land issue comes to a head. When we're talking about land allotments and the need that the US government has to somehow get its hands on the most fertile and agricultural important land in the state of Montana, and then to come find out, oops, we gave it to the Crow, now what? And so the 1887 Dawes Act was established to divide tribal land into small allotments to be awarded to individual members, with the express purpose to, quote, establish a capitalistic and proprietary relationship with property. Well, so the idea is that instead of having a communally owned land, we now break it up into small homesteads and we give each tribal member their own homestead. Well, now we can tax them, because now they own property. Well, the whole issue, though, is that the whole US is founded on this concept of no taxation without representation. So if we're going to tax them, we have to give them an avenue to citizenship. Well, nobody wants Native people to be citizens. What are we thinking? I say that sarcastically. This belief that they are incompetent, incapable, and unable to act as responsible citizens. And so the 1906 Burke Act establishes that if a Native person can be named competent, they can then receive the title ownership, land deed to their own land, and they can also receive ownership and use of their own bank account. Of course, they don't establish who gets to say you're competent, what checkboxes do you need to check off to be labeled competent, or even that there's a process to become competent, meaning that Native people could be named competent without their knowledge and then receive a bill for back taxes that they didn't even know they owed. It's at this point, specifically with the Crow, that we see those educated students step up, and their education becomes an incredible asset. Because early Crow leaders, when government agents first come to the reservation and they say, hey, we're gonna give you your own land, the Crow leaders step aside and they put forward a Carlisle graduate. His name is Carl Leader. And he proceeded to read an itemized list of unfulfilled promises from treaties. And he basically says, when you fulfill these promises, then we'll talk. Remember those rhetoric classes? Remember those classes on civic government and debate. I don't think this is how the government thought they would use that education. These educated men and women are learning to parrot the assimilated language that would appeal to government representatives, but they're using it specifically for tribal protections. For Frank and Shively, they're caught squarely in the middle. Both of them, as early Carlisle men, as early believers in the assimilation plan, were actually involved in the surveying and awarding of those first allotments on the reservation. In 1908, when one of the first lists of approved competent Indians is submitted for the government, both of their names are on that list, which means by 1908, they are considered able to live in American society. They can control their own bank account. They can have their own credit line at the store. They can be awarded their own land deeds. And the very education that allowed them to be deemed competent now starts separating them from their own people. And they're looked at unfavorably as more and more people within their own tribe will say, well, why do you get to be competent and I don't? Why do you get control of your life and I don't? You only got that because you work for the Indian agent's office. That's nepotism. That's favoritism. And yet both men continue to step up as advocates. They are attending delegations to Washington, D.C. They're using every opportunity they can to speak for their own tribe. In fact, Alex Upshaw would accompany Curtis on a book-selling trip in Washington, D.C., and would get an audience with Teddy Roosevelt. And instead of talking about Curtis's book, Alex wanted to talk about the Dawes Act and land acknowledgement, at which Roosevelt goes, yeah, I don't want to hear about that. You need to go talk to Taft. And he could never actually get an appointment with Taft, with Howard Taft. Frank would actually be part of a Crow delegation to Washington in 1908 and would speak at a Senate hearing. Frank would say, he says, we want title to our land. The whole tribe is one. Then if it comes that in the progress of our own work towards civilization and learning the methods of doing things just like Westerners, just like other people, we still want to retain the land and get title to it. Senator Charles Curtis, in response, would say, it is your land, but the government has the power to do as it pleases. If the government thinks it is in the best interest of the tribe to sell it, it will do so. But the land is yours. Both men would continue to work as interpreters between their tribal community and government representatives, and yet never gaining full acceptance or acknowledgement by either side. Both faced incredibly racist reactions from non-natives. Upshaw's marriage to a white woman named Emma would really rub people the wrong way. Shively would consistently be called just the educated red man in the office. In fact, when Edward Curtis was first looking at Upshaw as an interpreter, he was told by multiple Billings businessmen that Upshaw was, quote, of no use, lazy, dishonest, meddlesome, and a regular coyote. Curtis would then write in his own notes that he had actually found Upshaw had a thought and care for the welfare of his copper-skinned brothers and was a lovely, hardworking man. But we see that the racism and the prejudice isn't just happening from non-natives. They're also receiving it from their own people. Whoops, too far, sorry. Nope, this way. When Shively's name was put forward as a potential delegate to a Washington meeting, along with Robert Yellowtail, and his name was put before the tribal council, a man named Nose the Ground would step forward, and to Shively's face, he says, it is the rumor that Frank Shively, you are crooked. If you care to work for the interests of the white man, then you should get all that's coming to you. Go out and be a full-fledged citizen, then come to your reservation and disturb the interests of the Crow people. Bird Above, who we see here, would follow it up and say, I put the blame of our present condition, meaning the land issues, land allotments, I put the blame to the educated boys. If you are competent, why don't you go off the reservation and work like other competent people? Shively would not be elected to go on that delegation. In early 1900s, a journalist named Helen Gray would place charges of fraud, nepotism, and manipulation on the Indian agent's office in regards to land allotment. And she would specifically call out that interpreters were intentionally misinterpreting and misrepresenting the interests of Crow people. Well, that means that she's directly targeting Upshaw and Shively. There were multiple Native people, including Chief Plentycoo, who were brought under suspicion by her charges. And eventually, the federal government would actually send an inspector to the Crow Reservation to look into these issues. The inspector was a man named Z. Lewis Dalby, who, by the way, the Detroit Press described Dalby as a man who knew as much about Indians as Indians know about radium. Upshaw would then be named Dalby's chief interpreter. And so we have Shively, who's interpreting for the Indian agent's office, and we have Upshaw, who's now interpreting for the government inspector. And we can see how this is pulling them in multiple directions. And when Chief Plentycoo was called to to appear at a hearing with the inspector, Plentycoo actually refused to show up unless another interpreter was brought, because of the questions and the concerns that Gray and others had brought up. And yet this didn't stop Upshaw. Upshaw actually heads his own campaign to prevent Indian land from being leased by non-natives. He's actually stepping forward and becoming that advocate and campaigning against loss of native land. And we're gonna see that his involvement on the reservation and in this land issue was gonna raise some really challenging issues and concerns. And it comes to a head in late evening, October 18th, 1909. A hotel clerk calls a doctor to come to the hotel to remove or to check on a native man, being Alexander Upshaw. The doctor then calls for the police to come arrest this man who has passed out in his hotel room. So he's unconscious in his own space. They take him to jail, they put him in a cell, and when they check on him the next morning, they find him face down, dead in a pool of blood. The other inmates reported hearing him moaning and calling for help throughout the night. It was reported lying cold in the icy grasp of death with the blood-splattered walls and floors of his cell, with the story of is the story of an unexpected hemorrhage with Alexander Upshaw. They called the doctor back, by the way, and the doctor goes, oops, just kidding, he wasn't drunk, he had pneumonia. Cause of death is officially a pulmonary hemorrhage. While technically it is possible to die of a pulmonary hemorrhage from pneumonia, it is like 1 out of 1,000. More than likely, or what tends to happen with pulmonary hemorrhages is that they are a result of trauma. Alex's death actually makes national news. It is even reported in Carlisle and New York. But it really draws interest from state reporters. Multiple newspapers are calling attention to this case and raising questions about police inhumanity and police brutality, not for his cause of death, but because they left him in the cell and didn't check on him. The Anaconda Standard would call it a gross carelessness on the part of the police. They say just because a man is arrested that is no reason that he should be treated like a valueless animal. A human being has rights, and it is not the proper thing to thrust him into a cell and pay no further attention to him until he is arraigned in court. The Laurel Outlook would detail charges of this police brutality and would go on to call for all responsible officers to be fired. The jailer was Charles Hagee, who you see here. As far as I can tell, there is no action taken against Hagee at all. By 1914, he is promoted twice, and he eventually goes on to become a Billings police captain. Even in the wake of Upshaw's incredibly tragic death, Shively continues to put himself forward, to document his people's stories, to speak for them, to advocate for them. He continues to work with the most important leaders of both the Crow and the Cheyenne and Lakota tribes. He would, in 1913, he would accompany another delegation to Washington that included Plenty-Coup, Dick Wallace, White Man Runs Him, Medicine Crow, and Robert Yellowtail, and would serve as their chief interpreter for the presidential inaugural parade. And in 1921, he would be Plenty-Coup's interpreter of choice for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier's dedication. The photograph you see here, Shively is interpreting and working with Two Moons at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Shively would continue to submit cultural articles, to make himself available as an interpreter, and to work for his people all the way until his death in July of 1943. And so what we see are two men whose lives consistently and continually intersect with the most important and most influential components of not just Montana history, but national history. These things define our relationship with our indigenous neighbors. Many of the way things are today are because of, or were influenced by, the work that Alex and Frank put forward. They both stepped forward from their Carlisle education, and they're willing to grow. They're willing to change their ideas, and they're willing to work towards taking on hard things in order to make a difference. They recognize social activities, and they try to gain acceptance from white society. And when that doesn't work, they step forward and allow outsiders, they assist outsiders to help document and salvage their own culture while expressing their own Native agency. And then to acknowledge that that's not enough, to step forward and advocate and politically lobby for their own land, for their own people. And in the process, they find a way not only to protect and share the uniqueness of their own tribal people, but also to fight for the acknowledgement and equality of Native rights and Native values. And oh yeah, by the way, what about their idea to use football, right? We'll bring it full circle. Both men were avid athletic football fans their entire life. They both identified as Carlisle football men until their death. Frank actually loved to follow Washington State football and made several trips to Pullman to watch the games. In 1931, the Spokane Chronicle reported, Shively follows the team closely and gets real pleasure in contrasting the football methods of today with the antiquated and time-worn policy of 30 years ago. Upshaw would also continue to follow sports, and it would be said that he was interested in athletics of all kinds, and particularly so if an Indian team or organization was participating. Unfortunately, they never really realized this idea of using athletics as a way for Native people to gain acceptance into American society, even up to the most famous and considered to be the best athlete in American history, Jim Thorpe. In 1953, when Thorpe died, the newspaper headlines were Indian athlete, dead at 53. And it makes me wonder if the statement that Curtis had made about Upshaw early in his career didn't prove true. Curtis wrote, "The odds against the advance of the educated Indian, barriers interposed by the white people who ought to be aiding them, those barriers are too many to be overcome." And while that may have been true for Frank and Alex, I really hope that we're able to move forward so that it's no longer true today. Guys, thank you very, very much for spending time with me, and I hope that we've learned a little bit more about these two amazing men, and I hope that we're able to share more about their story because I think they absolutely deserve it. And if we have, we are right at our time, but if we have a couple questions, I'd love to entertain them.
Who is Carlisle?
Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's right outside of Hershey, Pennsylvania. Yes.
I have more of a statement based on the Washington and the Redskins. It's quite interesting that that's where that came to be, and that's where they went to football, because the Redskins also have a they did have a very native backing and background as far as I know a lot of the family members from the grandfather her great-grandfather or grandfather back,
So-
designed that.
Well, so the concept of having mascots be people is always complex.
But the Washington Redskins were also one of the highest employers for Native people in the NFL.
That's a separate subject.
It's just it's a story that ties in some ways since Frank was at Washington State for the college. That kind of the energy was there to kind of bring up two more things. So there's a connection there somehow.
Well, Washington State has no association with Washington, D.C. football team.
Washington Redskins?
Yeah, that's Washington, D.C. So Washington State is a completely different association and team. Yeah.
Well, Lauren, I just want to thank you. I think you're brilliant.
Alex or Kevin, did you hear that?
Kevin knows I think.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Kevin knows I think you're brilliant.
Thank you, that's very kind.
What struck me as you were talking is that so many of the issues that Frank Shively and Alexander Upshaw dealt with continue to be dealt with today. So if you're a young man or a young woman who's of indigenous heritage and you're trying to find your way in the white world, it's damn tough. And they talk about barriers and often hard to overcome those barriers. They're just everywhere. And the other thing was the land issue. And several years ago, I was involved in a probate of some Indian trust land. And the BIA, or whoever it was, the Department of Interior, had internal regulations about how property would pass if there was not a will. And so there were even no laws that were, the Department of Interior, I'll just say it was them, I don't know, but they would even determine how your estate would pass for you. And it's all based on this paternal approach of the United States government.
Well, and one of the issues that Alex and Frank were specifically talking against and advocating against were those unclear laws of beneficiary, unclear property transfer laws. It's still an issue, and it's unclear if Frank was involved specifically in the writing of the Crow Act of 1920, but the very things that he's talking about and advocating against and for are the very things that are typed or that are written into the Crow Act of 1920, specifically in Section 2, and it's still an issue. The things that these men were working for and against, it is still setting precedent today in the court systems of Montana and across the country. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, that's the reality that you see as a historian over and over again. Are there any other questions about Shively and Upshaw? Well, thank you guys very, very much.